The Ordnance quick-firing 6-pounder 7cwt, or just 6-pounder, was a British 57mm gun, serving as a primary anti-tank gun of the British Army during World War II, as well as the main armament for a number of armoured fighting vehicles. Although planned before the start of the war, it did not reach service until the North African Campaign in April 1942. There it replaced the 2-pounder in the anti-tank role, allowing the 25-pounder gun howitzer to revert to its intended artillery role. The United States Army also adopted the 6-pounder as their primary anti-tank gun under the designation 57mm gun M1. Development and production. Development. Limitations of the existing 2-pounders were apparent even as the gun was first entering service, and an effort was made to replace it with a much more capable weapon starting as early as 1938. The Woolwich Arsenal was entrusted with the development of a new gun with a caliber of 57mm. Guns of this caliber had been employed by the Royal Navy from the late 19th century, and therefore manufacturing equipment was available. The gun design was complete by 1940, but the carriage design was not completed until 1941. The production was further delayed by the defeat in the Battle of France. The loss of equipment. Most of the BEF's heavy equipment had to be left behind in France during Operation Dynamo, and the prospect of a German invasion made re-equipping the army with anti-tank weapons an urgent task, so a decision was made to carry on the production of the 2-pounder, avoiding the period of adaptation to production, and also of retraining and acclimatization with the new weapon. It was estimated that 106-pounders would displace the production of 600 2-pounders. This had the effect of delaying production of the 6-pounder until November 1941 and its entry into service until May 1942. Unlike the 2-pounder, the new gun was mounted on a conventional 2-wheeled split-trail carriage. The first mass production variant, the Mk2, differed from the pre-production Mki in having a shorter L/43 barrel, because of shortage of suitable lathes. The subsequent Mk4 was fitted with a L/50 barrel, with muzzle brake. Optional side shields were issued to give the crew better protection, but were apparently rarely used. The 6-pounder was used where possible to replace the 2-pounder in current British tanks, requiring work on the turrets, pending the introduction of new tanks designed to take the 6-pounder from the outset. The Churchill Marks III and IV, Valentine Mark IX and Crusader Mark III all began to enter service during 1942. The Valentine and Crusader both needed to lose a crew member from the turret. Those tanks designed to take the 6-pounder from the outset were the problematic Cavalier, the Cromwell, and the Centaur. However, when the Cromwell went into combat in 1944, it was armed with the Ordnance QF 75mm gun, which was a redesign of the 6-pounder to take US 75mm ammunition and more useful against general targets. The 6-pounder was also fitted to the AEC Armored Car Mark II. Although the 6-pounder was kept at least somewhat competitive through the war, the Army nevertheless started development of a more powerful weapon in 1942. The aim was to produce a gun with the same general dimensions and weight as the 6-pounder, but with improved performance. The first attempt was an 8-pounder of 59 caliber length, but this version proved too heavy to be used in the same role as the 6-pounder. A second attempt was made with a shorter 48 caliber barrel, but this proved to have only marginally better performance than the 6-pounder. The program was eventually cancelled in January 1943. Instead, the 6-pounder was followed into production and service by the next generation British anti-tank gun, the 17-pounder, which came into use from February 1943. As a smaller and more maneuverable gun, the 6-pounder continued to be used by the British Army not only for the rest of World War II, but also for some 20 years afterwards. A 57/42.6 mm squeeze bore adapter was developed for the gun but was never adopted. In addition to the UK, the gun was produced in both South Africa, where the Combined Ordnance Factories, COFAC, produced 300, and Canada. U.S. production. The idea of manufacturing the 6-pounder in the U.S. was expressed by the U.S. Army Ordnance in February 1941. At that time, the U.S. Army still favored the 37mm gun M3 and production was planned solely for Lend-Lease. The U.S. version, classified as substitute standard under the designation 57mm gun M1, was based on the 6-pounder Mark II, 2 units of which were received from the UK. However, since there was sufficient lathe capacity, the longer barrel could be produced from the start. Production started early in 1942 and continued until 1945. The M1A1 variant used US combat tires and wheels. The M1A2 introduced the British practice of free traverse, meaning that the gun could be traversed by the crew pushing and pulling on the breech, instead of solely geared traverse, from September 1942. The M1 was made standard issue in the spring of 1943. A more stable carriage was developed but not introduced. Once the 57mm entered U.S. service, a modified towing point design was introduced, the M1A3, but only for U.S. use. Tractors for the M1 included the Dodge WC63 112-ton 6x6 and the White half-track. 2/3 of American production, 10,000 guns, went to U.S. Army divisions in Europe. About 1/3 of production, over 4,200 guns, was delivered to the UK and 400 guns were sent to Russia through Lend-Lease. When the United States rearmed and re-equipped Free French forces for the Normandy landings, their anti-tank units received American-made M1s. Like the British Army, the U.S. Army also experimented with a squeeze-bore adapter, 57/40mm T10, but the program was abandoned. American shell designs and production lagged behind the introduction of the gun once it was accepted for service, and so, at first, only a pea shot was available. The He shell was not available until after the Normandy landings and UK stocks were procured to cover its absence. Its use by regular U.S. Army frontline units was discontinued in the 1950s. Service history. British service. Anti-tank gun. The 6-pounders, and the US-built M1, of which 4,242 guns were received, were initially issued to the Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments of infantry and armoured divisions in the Western theatres, 4 batteries with 12 pieces each, and later in the war to the 6-gun anti-tank platoons of infantry battalions. An air landing battalion had an AA/AT company with 2 4-gun-AT platoons. The Far East theatres had lower priority and different organisation, reflecting the lower tank threat. The gun was also employed by Commonwealth forces in formations similar to the British. Initially, the anti-tank ammunition was a basic armour-piercing (AP) shot, but by January 1943 an armour-piercing (capped) APC shot and an armour-piercing (capped) ballistic capped (APC) shot was supplied. A high-explosive shell was produced so that the gun could also be used against unarmoured targets. The 6-pounder first saw action in May 1942 at Gazala. It made an immediate impact on the battlefield as it was able to penetrate any enemy tank then in service. In the most celebrated action, the 6-pounder guns of 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, together with part of 239 anti-tank battery Royal Artillery under command, destroyed more than 15 enemy tanks in the action at Snipe during the Second Battle of El Alamein. However, over the next year, the Germans introduced much heavier designs into service, notably the Tiger I and Panther. The standard 6-pounder shot was ineffective against the front armour at any range, but proved effective on the less armoured sides and rear armour. A 6-pounder gun accounted for the first Tigers disabled in North Africa, 2 Tigers falling to towed 6-pounder at guns. 48 RTR knocked out the first Tigers by the Western Allies in tank versus tank action with their Chichils destroying 2 Tiger I. The same unit also knocked out the first Panther tanks by the Western Allies in May 1944 in Italy. The North Irish Horse knocked out and captured Tiger 131 after the crew had abandoned it following it receiving several hits. The situation was somewhat improved by the development of more sophisticated ammunition in the form of the armour-piercing, composite rigid, APCR, shot and the armour-piercing, discarding sabot, APDS, shot, which was available from 1944 and made it effective in fighting the Tiger I and Panther tanks frontally. In the Royal Artillery regiments, the 6-pounders were joined by the 17-pounders starting in 1943, but in infantry units, the gun remained the sole gun in service until 1951, when it was finally declared obsolete and replaced by the 17-pounder in the British Army of the Rhine, BAOR. Tank gun. The first tank to go into action armed with the 6-pounder gun, was the Mark III version of the Churchill tank, in the Dieppe raid of August 1942. They were deployed to North Africa. 6, as King Force, were in action at El Alamein in October, destroying 5 tanks and 3 guns for the loss of 1 Churchill. Molin's gun. The Royal Navy used the 6-pounder extensively in motor gunboats during World War II, especially the D-type. The gun was mounted on a hydraulic-powered mount and fitted with the Molin's power loading system, permitting a 6-round burst at 1 round per second. The guns were all the early short-barrel, 43 caliber, type, and fired exclusively high explosive, ammunition, at much lower muzzle velocities than for AP, armor-piercing, because of the use of flashless propellant for night operations. The naval designation was QF 6-pounder MKIIA, nearly 600 of these weapons were made. The Molin's autoloader was also deployed on a small number of Royal Air Force de Havilland Mosquitoes of Coastal Command, which were referred to as the Tsetse, after the biting fly. Officially the QF-6 PDR Class M marked the first with autoloader Mk3, it was based on the long-barreled, 50 caliber, gun. It was fully automatic, with a rate of fire of about 55 rounds per minute, with an ammunition supply of 21 rounds. It was intended for use against U-boats and fired solid shot that could penetrate their hulls through 2 feet, 61 centimeters, of water. The weapon was successfully used to sink U-boats and to shoot down a Junkers 88 aircraft. It was replaced in 1943 by the more versatile but less accurate 3-inch rocket projectile. U.S. service. In spring 1943, following the experience of the North African Campaign, the infantry branch of the U.S. Army recognized the need to field a heavier anti-tank gun than the 37mm M3. The Ordnance QF 6-pounder was introduced into U.S. service as the 57mm M1, following standard U.S. nomenclature. Introduction was made in the face of objections by the U.S. Army Infantry Board, which believed it to be too heavy. The Ordnance Board on the other hand felt that a more powerful weapon should be introduced. The airborne and cavalry rejected it. According to the Table of Organization and Equipment, TONE, from May 26, 1943, a regimental anti-tank company included 9 57mm guns and each battalion had an anti-tank platoon with 3 guns, giving a total of 18 guns per regiment. Dodge WC-62/WC-63 6x6 1/2-ton trucks were issued as artillery tractors in place of the 3/4-ton truck used with its predecessor the 37mm. Because of the unexpected adoption into service, the only ammunition type in production in the U.S. was the AP ammunition. By mid-1944, the M1 was the standard anti-tank gun of the U.S. infantry in the Western Front and outnumbered the M3 in Italy. Preparation for the D-Day invasion of Normandy highlighted an additional need. The Airborne Command had rejected the 57mm M1 in the summer of 1943 however, claiming that it was unfit for air landing by glider due to its weight, and the TONE of February 1944 still had airborne divisions keeping their 37mm guns. To increase firepower, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions were re-equipped with British-manufactured 6-pounders on the narrow carriage Mk3 designed for glider use, 24 in AA Battalion, and 9 in Glider Infantry Regiment for the Normandy airdrops. In the fighting after the Normandy landings, the paratroops used them against German armour near Saint-Mère-Église and Corentin. However, few tanks were encountered and they were mostly used for support, which made the lack of an HE shell more significant. The British 6-pounder with the Mk3 carriage was also used by 442 Company as part of the glider invasion force assigned at that time to the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 1st Airborne Task Force, during Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. Limited availability of different ammunition types limited the efficiency of the gun in the infantry support role. Only after the Normandy campaign did the He round reach the battlefield, although US units were sometimes able to get a limited amount of He ammunition from the British Army. The canister shot was not seen in significant amounts until early 1945. Some British stocks of APDS were supplied to the US units, although APCR and APDS rounds were never developed by the US. From July, US anti-tank units encountered the Panther tank, which was only vulnerable to the 57 mm from the sides. Towed anti-tank guns were less effective in the hedgerow terrain, where mobility suffered, but, when the Germans went on the offensive in August, they were effective in defense with infantry. Subsequently, the guns were officially introduced under the TONE from December 1944. According to the TONE, a division was issued 50 pieces, 8 in the divisional artillery, 24 in the AA battalion, and 18 in the glider infantry regiment. Parachute infantry regiments did not have anti-tank guns. The British guns were referred simply as 57 mm guns. Towards the end of the war, towed anti-tank units were out of favor due to their lack of mobility compared to self-propelled guns, and the 57 mm was used by infantry battalions. However, with few tanks to contend with, some units that would have been equipped with the 57 mm were instead deployed as rifle companies or only with the bazooka. The M1 went out of service in the US soon after the end of the war. Other operators. In addition to being used by the US, British and Commonwealth forces, the M1 was supplied under the Lend-Lease program to the Free French Forces, 653, USSR, 400, and Brazil, 57. Guns captured by the Germans were given the designations 5.7 cm Pak 209, E, and 5.7 cm Pak 202, A. The Israel Defense Forces employed the 6-pounder in the 1950s in brigade-level anti-tank battalions and battalion-level anti-tank platoons. The latter formations were disbanded in 1953. By late 1955, the Israel Defense Forces possessed 157 pieces and 100 more were purchased from the Netherlands in 1956, too late to enter service before the Suez Crisis. Some of those are described as 57 mm guns, nearly identical to the 6-pounders and firing the same ammunition, which apparently makes them US-built M1 guns. The gun was also used by the Pakistani Army. Numerous examples can still be seen as gate guards outside army bases in Pakistan. The Irish Army acquired 6 6-pounder anti-tank guns in the late 1940s. The US 57 mm M1 gun is popular with modern-day cannoneers, as there is a relatively good supply of shell casings and projectiles. The gun is also reportedly still in active military use with some South American countries, and in coastal defense emplacements of outlying island garrisons of the Republic of China Army. Variants: Mk1, limited production version with L/50 barrel. Mk2, first mass production version. Shortened L/43 barrel was adopted due to the shortage of suitable manufacturing equipment. Mk3, tank version of Mk2. Mk4, L/50 barrel, single baffle muzzle brake. Mk5, tank version of Mk4. Mullins Class M gun, 6-pounder gun fitted with automatic loader built by the Mullins Company, a manufacturer of cigarette-making machines. It was mounted on the Royal Navy motor torpedo boats and in the RAF Mosquito planes, which were referred to as the Tsetsi. 57 mm gun M1, US-built version, although based on Mk2, it had the original L/50 barrel. Carriage types: British. Mk1. Mk1A, different axle and wheels. Mk2, simplified design. Mk3, modified for use by airborne troops. Carriage types: US. M1. M1A1, US wheels and tires. M1A2, 1942 improved traverse mechanism, allowing free traverse. M1A3, 1943 modified towing hook, the first version to be adopted by the US Army. M2, 1944 caster wheel added to the right trail, relocated trail handles, new utility box. M2A1, 1945 improved elevation gear. Self-propelled mounts. Tank gun versions of the 6-pounder were used in Crusader 3, Cavalier, Centaur I and II, Cromwell I-3, Valentine 8-X and Churchill 3 and 4, and also in the Canadian Ram Mk2 and the prototype American light tank T-72. The Deacon and the experimental Electo Mk2 self-propelled guns also mounted the 6-pounder. Another experimental vehicle armed with the 6-pounder was a Firefly tank destroyer, based on the Morris Light reconnaissance car. The only mass-produced vehicle mounting the 57mm M1 was the M3 half-track-based 57mm gun motor carriage T-48, also known by its Soviet designation Su-57. The production of the T-182 armored car, also known as Boarhound, was stopped after 30 units were built. A project for a tank destroyer armed with the M1 the 57mm gun motor carriage T-49 was cancelled after a single pilot vehicle was built. Similarly, the wheeled 57mm gun motor carriage T-44, based on Ford 4x4 3/4 ton cargo carrier chassis, was cancelled after a brief testing.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.